Welcome to the final act of this three-part mini-series called Are You a Person? This final act will introduce you to how this information actually impacts you so you can make serious, informed decisions from now on about your personhood. So, here we go. With all of the information that we have discussed over the last two acts, you may naturally begin to wonder, if I am not a person, then what am I? If I say I am not a person, does that mean I have no rights in law? Will I get into trouble if I don't agree to being a person? If I say I am not a person, does that mean I will lose my property? These kinds of questions are very valid, and I'm sure many people will have these questions themselves. So let's explore them a tad bit to really make sure we are doing the right thing. If you question, if I am not a person, then what am I? Obviously, I cannot tell you what you are. Only you know what you are or what you are not, as you are the only individual in this world that truly knows with first-hand knowledge what it is like to be you. However, when we talk about person in legal terms, I would suggest it is in your best interest to express yourself as a living man or woman, the key part being the living part. Because this shows the distinction between your legal personality or your legal identity or your sole proprietor, all of which are mental constructs that are evidenced on paper, which are void of life, and therefore we can say that they are logically dead. As you are the living, this sets the distinction from these two entities from the get-go. The next question was, if I say I am not a person, does that mean I have no rights in law? Which is an amazing question, which actually allows me to get a really fundamental point across to you that you need to be aware of. Your rights exist regardless of how the law recognizes you. All that the law does is support those rights that you already have. Why and how, you may wonder? Well, it is because a right is something that you can do because it does not harm anyone else in the process. On the opposite side of things, anything that you do which does harm someone else, that is not a right that you will have. For example, we all know that we have a right to life. We also have a right to remain silent. We also have a right to free speech. We have a right to defend ourselves if someone is claiming against us. We have a right to self-defense if someone's physically trying to harm you, right? You have the right to privacy in your own home, a right to self-expression. The list really goes on and on and on. Now let's think about the rights that you do not have, such as to murder someone, to touch other people without their consent, to use the property of others without their consent, to steal the property of others, to hold others in slavery or servitude, to lie to others to get them to do something which is in direct opposition to their best interests. This list could go on and on and on as well. If your rights were dependent on the law and that law then got taken away for some reason, say it was repealed, for example, then you would no longer have that right. Say, for example, before the Human Rights Act of 1998, specifically Article 2, which states that you have a right to life that is protected by law. Do you think that before this existed, it meant that people did not have a right to life? And if something were to happen to this act, say it was repealed, do you think that your right to life would disappear also? Of course not, because a right is a right regardless of whether or not the law supports it or not. If this wasn't true, it would mean that rights are just privileges that are given, but also just as quickly can be taken away. And imagine, for example, if your fundamental right to life was just a privilege given to you because a law says so, not only does that mean that the lawmakers are acting as if they created your life and therefore they can control how long it lasts, but it also means that at any point the state would be able to simply take away that right from you, and now you must accept that you have no right to life, and therefore your life must be ended in line with the law because the law gave you that right, and so the law can take that right as well. The next question: will I get into trouble if I don't agree to to being a person. I would actually suggest that you get into more trouble when you do agree to being a person, because this is actually misrepresentation and fraud on your part, which is clearly wrong and deceitful of you, which then gives lawmakers and enforcers an excuse to basically do whatever they want to you, because you are the bad guy here after all. As we have discussed, everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law, which you can exercise or not, because with all rights, you have a choice if you want to engage with them or not. It is up to you based on your intentions and what you want for yourself, right? It is a choice you have to make. When you make a choice to withhold your consent from being a person because you've educated yourself on the real meaning of the word, and you realize that you cannot claim to be a person because it doesn't apply to you directly, then you're actually making a fully informed decision and doing the right thing. You're actually being truthful and honest with yourself and others. And the last question, if I say I'm not a person, does that mean I will lose my property? The simple answer is no. In law, the current legislation definition that we have discussed, and all of the United Nations content and the HMRC manual that we discussed as well, they all show us that you are not a person, but you definitely have a person, and this is undeniable. Your legal personality identity is always there for you to use as a tool. You cannot make it go away, nor should you try to, because it is a tool that you need to be able to function in our modern society. Our modern society is set up in a way that literally requires you to have a legal personality so you can lead a somewhat normal life. I say normal, but what is normal these days? I mean, think about it. Do you not take benefit from the legal personality in some way? Do you have a bank account? Do you enjoy going abroad on holiday maybe? Do you enjoy contracts for services which you use on a daily basis? If so, then you are taking benefit from your legal personality in some way, as you were meant to, because it was gifted to you for this purpose, remember? And also, for you to be able to own property in a way that the law actually recognizes and will enforce, you actually need the legal personality, because it is the only way in which you can own property which will actually be defended by the law. Just because you say you're not a person does not mean that the person ceases to exist. In fact, you cannot make the person not exist anymore. Even after you pass from this world, your person will exist forevermore in the records. So it just shows that it literally can't be destroyed. What you can actually focus on is in the expression of yourself as the living man or woman that you are, which is the sole living beneficiary of that assigned legal person. Remember, you have a right to self-expression, so exercise it to your fullest by saying you are a living man or woman, sole living beneficiary of the person that was gifted to you by the state upon the registration of your birth, which set the conditions for the birth certificate to be created. The legal tender that acts as a promissory note, wink wink. And hopefully you are able to see that identifying as a person or claiming to be one when you interact with the legal system, well, you're actually not doing yourself any favors as such. Instead, you are really acting to your own detriment, causing your own suffering as such. Why? Because you are misrepresenting yourself, because that is not your true essence based on the definition. Therefore, you are considered a wrongdoer, you are being deceitful, you are lying to yourself and others, and you're actually acting fraudulently, which actually takes things from the civil side of the law to do with contracts over to the criminal side of the law, where the state can come after you relentlessly, because fraudsters are criminals and therefore are treated and punished accordingly. If you feel that the way that your life has been going, you feel you're just constantly being punished and things just don't seem to go the way that you would want it to, it just doesn't seem fair, this series might start to show you why that may be. And I bet you never thought for a second that saying you are a person, whether expressly or just implicitly, could actually be viewed as such a serious crime, right? Again, this information leads me time and time again back to the saying and the maxim that ignorance of the law is no excuse, which I really take this maxim to teach me that I need to inform myself of the right information to make sure that I am doing everything correct, in line with not only the letter of the law, but also the spirit of the law. And I refuse to allow others to know the law on my behalf. I have to take responsibility to learn for myself so that I can do the right things and protect myself, as well as making it my goal to show others the information as well. So let's just touch on how this information applies to statutes at large. If statutes apply to persons, which they all do, either expressly or implicitly, and you are not a person as we have already established, then those statutes cannot logically apply to you. If the definition does not apply to you, and by definition you are not a person, then there is no man-made law that truly applies to you, unless you consent into that, right? Of course, this does not mean that you can behave badly and do all sorts of bad things that harm other people. You have to pay really close attention to what we're talking about here and the responsibility associated with this information. This is not a get out of jail free card. We know that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. For every behavior, there is a consequence. These concepts are well established and supported by mounds of evidence in both science, such as physics, but also in spiritual fields, such as the idea of karma, for example. So, you have been warned that with great power comes great responsibility, because at the end of the day, the only real laws that do apply to you are the laws that boil down to do no harm to your fellow man and love thy neighbor as yourself. If you grasp these fundamental laws, then you will grasp the fundamental laws of the universe and our creation, where you will begin to really grasp the world around you and within you in ways which you may never have thought possible before. This information is truly powerful, and therefore I do urge you to come at this information from a very solid grounding in doing the right thing and being authentically you and having true care for others around you, right? And let's lastly touch on the impact of this information on the interpretation of statutes. So it is well established that one of the key roles of a court is to interpret and apply points of law derived from Acts of Parliament. So basically to figure out what the drafters of the instruments actually meant and how this is supposed to apply in real life situations. The judges themselves are the ones who will be interpreting what Parliament appears to have intended with the instruments that they have drafted, which refers more to the spirit of the law in addition to the letter of the law, right? So one of the ways in which judges interpret the law is through the use of the literal rule, where words must be understood by their ordinary and literal meaning. And if a word is clearly defined, then those words must be applied regardless of whether the outcome is the desired outcome or not, as was intended by the drafters. So again, when using the literal rule and the definition of the word person as provided for in the legislation, we can see that those acts which apply to persons naturally mean that they do not apply to living men and women. It will only apply to the legal personality, the legal person, the natural person, the sole proprietor, whatever you want to call it as such. Why? Because the man-made laws apply to man-made things. The laws of the universe, which underpin the makeup of our universe and all the physical and non-physical manifestations of it, they apply to living men and women as creations of the natural world, our ancestors, and all of the universal forces of life which we all experience as a shared commonality. If you don't believe me that the literal rule and the definitions of words matter in the law, take this case law for example, which demonstrates this idea perfectly. The case of Whiteley v. Chappell in 1868 was about a defendant who was charged with impersonating any person entitled to vote. The literal rule was applied where the court held that impersonating a deceased person, which is what the defendant actually did, this did not fall under the statute's wording because the deceased person is not entitled to vote. So this meant the defendant was acquitted, so found not guilty, based on the use of the literal rule alone. So you can see how powerful and valuable this information about personhood is. So this brings us to the end of this three-part mini-series, where we have truly and deeply answered the question, are you a person? We have covered some serious ground, including the etymological roots of the word person, the definition of person in everyday English and legal English, the rebuttable assumption that you are a person, the implications of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the United Nations Legal Identity for All, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the HMRC Internal Manual on VAT registration. And we've discussed the information needed so you're able to make the fully informed decision to not be a person, and we've discussed the implications that this information has on the statutes. And with the conclusion of this three-part series, I hope that you have been able to learn some really potent information that has really opened your eyes to a truth that is so shocking and so vital. And hopefully you will simply not be able to ignore this information. If this series was valuable to you, then I urge you to share it with someone who will be grateful that you shared this resource with them. And don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, because there is so much more where this came from. So thank you for taking the time to learn with me, and I look forward to doing it again soon. Bye for now.